good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Fritz Mayer, professor here at the Sanford School and director of Polis, the Center for Political Leadership, Innovation, and Service. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Grover Norquist to campus. So welcome to Duke.
Glad to be here.
It's great to have you here.
Second time. I was here once before with a similar structure.
Excellent. Well, as you probably know, Grover Norquist is one of the really most influential figures in conservative movement in the United States over the last, well, almost 40 years now. He is the founder and so president of Americans for Tax Reform, a very influential group about which we'll hear more. He has been sort of a commentator, a writer, a podcaster, and somewhat public figure, but in some ways his real influence has been behind the scenes, I'd say, and we'll talk a bit about that and the ways in which he's had an influence on policy, especially tax policy, for which he's most known, but not exclusively that, but really tax regulatory issues. Grover and I actually were classmates at Harvard. He has a BA from Harvard College, and then we parted ways. He has an MBA from across the river. I have an MPP degree from the Kennedy School, so we parted ways.
Just a few blocks.
Yeah, just very close. Although I did most of my dissertation work at the business school. He has been. I said that there was a great quote from Harry Reid, who was once so exasperated that he said the Republicans are being led like puppets by Grover Norquist. They're giving speeches that they should compromise on our deficit, but never do they compromise on Grover Norquist, which I take it you would take as a badge of honor to get those words from Harry Reid. Among his other things, this is on his Wikipedia page, he's competed several times for the funniest celebrity in D.C., coming in second at least once. So I won't try to spar with Grover this evening. Anyway, delighted to have you here. Welcome. Maybe just begin by saying a few words about the arc of your career, which is really, I don't know where you want to begin it, but it's really quite a fascinating arc, and then we can explore in more detail some of the facets of that.
Sure. Kindergarten through high school, Weston, Massachusetts, 12 miles outside of Boston. Down the street from where they had cell meetings during the Cold War, and went to Harvard, studied economics, got out of college, came down to Washington D.C., ran the National Taxpayers Union. I was supposed to be the #2 guy, but by the time I got there, people had moved around. I got to be executive director of the College Republicans right at the time that Proposition 13 was blowing up in California. So we were the only national taxpayer group around. There were California ones and some state ones. And so we were right in the middle of the fight there. Then I went back to business school for 2 years, came back to DC, worked with the Republican Party, worked with the Chamber of Commerce. And then the White House put together Americans for Tax Reform the way Obama put together Organizing for America. They set it up and asked somebody to run it. So they set it up and asked me to run it in '85. The goal was to pass the Tax Reform Act of '86, which we did. And I created the Taxpayer Protection Pledge in order to pass the '86 bill. And then since then have been running Americans for Tax Reform, fighting against all tax cuts against all tax increases, for most tax reductions, as well as anything that deals with reducing the size and scope of government. And in '93 created the Wednesday meeting, which is a coalition meeting, started at 20 people, now 150 people, who meet weekly, and just let everybody know what everybody's doing in the center-right movement, so that the broad Reagan Republican zone is self-aware of what they're doing and what the options are. And that's what I'm still doing.
Well, that's quite an arc. Let me ask what every interviewer is now asking everyone. So, are you going to run for president?
No. It's having too much fun.
Well, the serious side of that question, though, is there are a lot of ways to try to influence policy in the world, and running for office might be one of them. But you obviously took a different path, and I was curious how you obviously didn't start out knowing what you were going to do, but how did your strategy evolve, and what were the key elements? You alluded to a couple of things: the pledge. Mm-hmm. Which has been immensely influential. I think almost every Republican, at least running for office, has taken the pledge and lived in fear of violating it. But say a bit about that, and then the Wednesday group, and sort of how that's worked, and sure. A little bit about the strategy that you've used.
But start with, I decided at a young age that politics mattered. This was during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and they were playing for keeps, and so I was a foreign policy anti-communist first, and then began to realize our government had its own problems, and it was too big and too annoying and too destructive of human liberty. So I wanted to downsize the costs that our government imposed on us, while at the same time being serious about keeping threats away from the states. And also that I wanted to get involved in that political struggle because it mattered. That if I'd grown up in Belgium, it probably wouldn't matter if you got absolutely everything right in Belgium, because Germany would eat you anyway. And no one would notice that you'd gotten everything very good, because you'd be overcome by larger states all around you. And the French would eat you before the Germans would eat you. But here in the States, if we get it right, things matter. If we get it right, people live. If we get it wrong, people die, and not just here, but around the globe. So there wasn't really an option to do something else. You can't go, I won't do this one. I'd have passed if I was born in Canada, I guess. But here, you're shooting with real bullets, playing in a place where the score really mattered, and it affected the whole world, not just people here. If we don't do our job right, not only do we suffer, but the whole world suffers. So that kind of focused me, and I said, okay, that's what I'm going to be doing. And then as I bounced, I sort of looked around. It wasn't complete strategy, except taxes were clearly going to be a key part of it, because the central issue is what's the role of the individual and what's the role of the state? How much control over individuals does the state have? Do you get to run your own life? Does somebody else run your own life? How much of your life do you get to run? How much of your life does somebody take away from you? How many decisions are your decisions? How many decisions are the Politburo, the Commissar, the town zoning commissioner tell you what you can do or can't do? And that's the place where the rubber hits the road there is taxes. How much of your time does the state take? And when they take your time, your money, the money you earned with your time, they then take that money and use it to make rules for you. If we reduce the size and scope of taxes, it limits the damage government can do and the control it can exercise over individuals. And every time we take the amount of money the government takes down, that's more of your life that belongs to you, more of your time that's yours. And you can spend your time any way you want, making money, praying, playing baseball, whatever it is, but that gets taken away from you when the state absorbs resources by force, by threat of force. So that was central. And the Taxpayer Protection Pledge, we were talking earlier, there are three unique things that I've focused on, created. One was the Taxpayer Protection Pledge. And that, as I look around, we were trying to pass the tax reform of 1986. We were going to take the rates down. Remember, the top rate then was 50%. We brought it down to 28%. And we broadened the base. It was revenue neutral. This is a thoroughly bipartisan bill. Gephardt, the leader of the House side, was key in it. The basketball player from New Jersey, Bradley.
Bill Bradley.
Bill Bradley was a key Democrat, and then Republicans and Democrats together mostly voted for the bill, the final bill. Rates came down, base was broadened, revenue neutral, not a tax increase. But we worried it might be a tax increase at the last minute when they went into the smoke-filled room and moved the little shells around and said, "Oh, look, no, it's not tax increase. Stop moving. Let's look under the shells." And so I got 20 senators and 100 congressmen and one president to sign the pledge. We will never vote. We will oppose and vote against any effort to raise net taxes. No net tax increase. You can move stuff around, raise that tax, cut that tax, but no net tax increase. And with that, we knew we could keep it revenue neutral or better. We did. And then that, by '88, all the Republicans running for president took the pledge, with the exception of Bob Dole. And he was winning until the New Hampshire primary, when the other candidates handed Bob Dole the pledge and said, "We've all made the written commitment to the American people, not to me," as Obama and Harry Reid seem to think.
Yeah.
It says, "To the American people" on the pledge. "We've all taken this pledge to the American people not to raise taxes. Will you?" And he hadn't. And they kind of tossed it at him, and he reacted as if he was a vampire and somebody tossed a cross in his lap on TV, which didn't go over well. And he had lost the New Hampshire primary. That mattered because in New Hampshire, they had something called the pledge, which was no income tax, no sales tax, no broad-based sales tax, no state income tax. So even though the pledge that I designed was a national federal tax pledge, everybody in New Hampshire knew the pledge meant a tax thing. So it was an easier explanation to New Hampshire than any other state as to what it meant. He lost. Bush went on. He was down 14 points, losing to Dukakis. And then he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And then he won by 8 points or so. So he got elected. He won the primary because he took the pledge. He won the general because he made the same commitment, both in writing and verbally. And then he raised taxes in 1990 and lost. And that's when the Republicans said, "I get it. Take the pledge, win the primary. Take the pledge, win the general. Keep the pledge, get reelected." And in '94, when the Republicans swept the House and the Senate, we had 98% of all the candidates taking the pledge. And they've all kept it since. The only time your federal taxes have been increased since 1993, when the Clinton people raised taxes and then lost the next election. The only time we've ever raised taxes since '90, when the Republicans helped, some Republicans helped, were the 2 years when Clinton had the House and the Senate, Democrat, and a Democrat president. So we had all three. He raised taxes, lost in '94, everything, House and Senate. And then during all that period, the Republicans had both houses or both houses in the presidency, no tax increase at all, many tax cuts. In 2009, Obama came in, Democrat House and Senate, supermajorities, raised taxes again, lost the House, lost most of the Senate, lost the Senate, and then the Republicans held things since. So the only time you can raise taxes in the country is when the Democrats have complete control of government. And as long as the Republicans have the House, Senate, the presidency, they won't raise taxes. And that's been enough to maintain the Republicans in control of Congress much more often than not since then. I mean, there's just been a few times when they've lost. Last year we lost, for 2 years, we lost the House, but not the Senate. So we're not going to raise taxes. So that pledge has made it easy for people to make it clear that they won't raise taxes. A lot of people, there's a wonderful study out of Washington State University. People who promise not to raise taxes, it has no effect at all on whether they'll raise taxes if they just say it. If they sign the pledge, they won't raise your taxes. And we at the state level have had some people who broke the pledge, and we go remind voters about that. But at the national level, we haven't.
Is that right? No one's broken the pledge? They've all...
Not at the federal level.
Yeah.
It's too visible. At the state level,
Very visible. Yeah.
Sometimes things move around a little bit more. But pretty much people at state level take the pledge, they keep it too, particularly governors.
Yeah.
And so it's been a powerful tool for branding the modern Republican Party as the party that won't raise your taxes. I came to the thought that we should do this many years ago when I was in school and the teachers were going, democracy doesn't work, nobody knows who their state legislator is or their congressman, and nobody knows anything, and so it really doesn't matter. And I said, well, what if, not to the teacher, but to myself, I said, what if the Republican Party became the party that would not raise your taxes? And that was the brand. I said, that ought to be good for 45% of the vote, and then you go out and kiss some babies and talk about other issues. But that would be something that then people would know, that if you went into the voting booth, dead drunk, as long as you voted for the R, they won't raise your taxes. Okay, that would be a pretty good start on what we were trying to get to, and the pledge actually did that.
So let me, I mean, you've been, the pledge, all this dynamic has been at some level enormously successful. I mean, you mentioned at the point where you formed this, it was the top marginal rate was 50%. It had been 70% prior to that.
And 90%
and 90%
before that?
in the 50s and through most of the 60s, 70%. Then 50 down to 28, bounce back up, as you mentioned. But now with the latest, I think we're at 37% top marginal rate. So it's really declined. Corporate rates were once close to 50 or above for a brief time, down to 35%, I think, 34, and then 35%, and then now 22%. 21%. So
Rubio tried to take it to 22. Bad.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I didn't mean to. Shouldn't you declare victory? Congratulations. That's a fantastic record in terms of moving the tax rates, and it's much more complicated than obviously top marginal rates, et cetera. But still, the basic story is one of really pushing the tax rates down. So are you done?
No, we've had a good start. To give you some idea of how much progress we have yet to make, before this country was founded, when there were 13 colonies, the average colonialist paid between 1% and 2% of their income in taxes, 1% to 2%. We were about the wealthiest people in the world, richer than people who lived in England. In England, the people in London paid 20% for the privilege of occupying the United States and telling us what to do and poking us. And they thought about going to 3% in taxing us, and we started shooting at them, and they left. So 1% to 2% worked fine. You didn't go above 5% until you hit the Civil War, and then back down again. And then you had World War I, which spiked. It was World War II, which spiked and then stayed. And we've been at 15 to 18% federal taxes, plus state and local, ever since. It's been fairly constant. But we have functioned quite well and grown much more rapidly and had much more economic growth and more immigrants and more GDP growth and wealth growth during the periods when we had no income tax, zero. Zero is a good number. So I think we should look at keep moving it down. There's certainly many things the government does now that it need not do. There are many things the government does now that are just destructive. So you make a list of all the things that are openly destructive and stop doing them, and then take a look at the things that might be done better at the state level, at the local level, or privately.
Let me come to some of those things in a minute, but I'm just sort of curious. So in this let's take 40-year time span in which the rates have come down. I guess the fundamental question is one of, has it worked? So in that time period, rates significantly lower, but annual GDP growth is actually slightly less on average over the decades over time. The 50s was volatile, 60s was higher, but growth hasn't been that great. What we do know is that inequality has risen, so that the top 1% has 40% of the wealth. The top, the statistics. We've seen social mobility is less, economic mobility is less. So now Americans born in the bottom quintile we're just about the bottom, close to the bottom of the OECD in terms of the probability that you'll get to the top. So the question is, why should we double down on a strategy of cutting taxes.
Well, if we hadn't cut taxes, we'd be in significantly worse shape than we are today. Remember, it's not only that we've reduced tax rates. The rest of the world watched what we did, and the rest of the world followed. Cortez, the newly elected congresswoman from New York, said, we ought to go to 70%. We did that once. Yeah, we did that once. And when John F. Kennedy said this is the stupidest thing in the world and cut taxes across the board, you had strong growth in the 60s until Richard Nixon raised taxes, thank you, because we went from 70 down to 50 and cut all rates across the board. The rest of the world watched. The Beatles song Taxman, right? 19 for the government, 1 for you. A 95% tax rate in Britain. This is why the Beatles live in America and not in Britain. They left, and everybody who knows how to play tennis in Sweden got out of the place. And they watched countries that had high marginal tax rates do very poorly, and all the world dropped their rates. There isn't a country in the world, not Zimbabwe, not communist China, not any place that has a 70% rate. Cortez is going, we did that once, the whole world did it once, and we all decided it was stupid and destructive and lousy for inequality. If you take a look at the top marginal tax rate, the lower the top marginal tax rate, the higher the percentage of total income taxes paid by the top 1%, and the less paid by the bottom half. So it's actually, when high marginal tax rates, partially because it gives you lousy growth, gives you a more weighted to lower income people tax burden. Counterintuitive if you're a lefty, but on my tweet, at Grover Norquist, you'll see the chart that American Enterprise Institute put out recently, which just gives you those numbers. It's pretty stark and helpful. It's also important to remember the left talks about inequality. And the reason they talk about inequality was that we had something called the Great Society, started in 1965, lasted for 50 years of the Great Society. The Democrats, the left, said, we, the government, know how to cure poverty. We can do this. We will have programs to solve poverty. And 50 years and $12 or more trillion in welfare, the percentages that the government says are poor have not particularly changed. And they didn't change the behaviors that make people not be successful, and they didn't make people not poor. So the shift to inequality is because the left has said, we got to quit telling people we know what we're doing and we can cure poverty. Here's what we can do. We can change the difference between the poorest guy and the richest guy. We just knock this guy's head off. And then, no, see, now there's less inequality. The Middle Ages had very little inequality because almost everybody was poor. And you can always get more inequality with more poverty. Whenever there's a recession, the country gets more equal. Great. So that is not something that's interesting to do, but it is something that a government can do by destroying wealth and income that some people have, and then you can make everybody more equal. No one better off, but more equal. And so it's the left talks about inequality because they're embarrassed by their failure of the state to fix poverty, and they want change. Stop asking us about poverty. We said we were going to fix it with about 12, 15 billion, trillion. Didn't work. Now we've got a new project. And they'll shift when they realize that they're not helping on inequality either. They'll shift from that. When they talk about Sweden, Denmark, there's less. When they were radically free market stuff up until about the 60s, when Sweden had the same tax burden that we did, and so on. As they were growing, they became less unequal, and when they got into becoming welfare state countries, they became less equal. So statism doesn't solve that problem. If you think it's a problem, I tend to think everybody should be free to do what they want, and stabbing Bill Gates in the back does not make anyone in the world better off. Makes the world more equal, but not anybody better off.
So we could explore this, and I'm sure we wouldn't necessarily agree. But just to be clear, you don't view that there is a problem here in the
there are many problems. There are many problems. You mentioned the lack of upward mobility.
Yeah,
We
right.
have back in the 1950s, 5% of jobs in the United States require a license, a government permit. You can't do that. You don't have a permit, 5%. It's now about 30%. You've heard all the horror stories about hair braiding and stuff. And this is real. I mean, these are real. Government law, you cannot do this until you have that. The guy in New York who was murdered by the police because he was selling somebody a single cigarette. That's against the law. And they tackled him and he suffocated because they were enforcing the law. The government's allowed to do this if you break the law. Of course, if you have stupid laws, it's particularly disgusting. So when you tell somebody, you can't get ahead in life by selling a single cigarette or braiding your neighbor's hair because it's against the law, and then you add into that all these, we've saw this, you guys have all lived through taxi commissions, Politburo, and Uber, free market, independent contractors. Which one would you rather work with, okay? Never mind which one's cleaner, which one gets there faster, and so on. But we've added 1 million people who drive Uber or Lyft or any of the other regional efforts on the same line. And those people have complete control over when they work, the hours they work. For some people, it's a full-time job. For some, I always talk to the guys who do it. Harvard professors, guys doing second jobs, people whose wives have told them, you're retired, you can't stay in the house all the time. And just really interesting approaches and when they work and why they work and so on. And those, 10 years ago, there was no Uber. 10 years ago, those 1 million people didn't have that option because stupid government laws, stupid government licensing, stupid government taxi cabs, making people's life worse, raising the cost of everybody else who wanted to go somewhere and be able to travel, and murdering people because every time Uber is moved into an area, drunk driving fatalities go down because it's easier and cheaper to get a cab, which you can't get. Uber was started. It's not true that big government doesn't accomplish things. The incompetent government of San Francisco, by having such a lousy taxi commission, they created Uber. And these people who couldn't get rides home after being out at bars created Uber, and then they said, we could scale this up, and did. And Airbnb also came from San Francisco because they had such stupid laws limiting the number of hotel rooms and making them massively too expensive that people were having conventions and they were selling, it's called Airbnb because they put air mattress. The guys who were calling people and saying, please come to our convention, they said, I'd love to, but there are no hotel rooms. Well, for $100 you can sleep on my couch. So they put those, and they said, we could do this and scale it, and they did. So 2 things that have made millions of Americans wealthier, happier, more successful, help pay the mortgage, were created because government was so stupid and evil that people figured out, and by the way, everywhere Uber existed, ever, they were corporate criminals. It was against the law. This is called economic civil disobedience. I know you have a stupid law against this. I don't care. We're doing it anyway. Go ahead. Put me in jail, jerks. And I don't know if you've ever seen the pictures of the Nevada, Las Vegas police wearing those East German terrorist masks, the ski masks that the East German terrorists from the 70s would wear. That's what they wore. Talk about they knew. If you have to wear a terrorist mask, do you think you kind of know what you're doing is disgusting and you don't want your family to know about it? Wrestling Uber drivers to the ground because they'd trick a guy into pulling over to offer someone a ride. That's a crime. And then they'd grab him and wrestle him to the ground with their terrorist mask on. This is the government we pay for. Why do we pay for this? Why would we want to pay for more of this?
So let's
and that kills the opportunity of people to move up. Also, incompetent public schools do.
Well, let's posit that government does some stupid things, taxi cab medallions being among them. So
not letting people go to competent schools instead of incompetent
But presumably, notwanding your earlier comment about zero taxes, there's some role for government. So as you know, Lincoln famously said, governments are the legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done but cannot do at all or cannot do so well for themselves in their separate individual capacities. You wrote a book called leave us alone.
Yeah.
So, which is more or less the same sentiment. But the question, my question to you really is quite serious: is what, as you think about the legitimate scope of government, where do you draw the lines? Obviously, there are things we're talking about some areas where we probably agree that. But there are this is a very contested area. How do you think about that question of what should government do?
First, do no harm, and respect the freedom of individuals to run their lives as they see fit. The idea that the government should get out of running people's economic lives to some statists to go, well, then how would it work? You talk to Eastern Europeans, they go, what do you mean, back when the Soviets were occupying it, what do you mean, how would you have any food if the government didn't run the farms? It couldn't occur to them that people could run farms on their own without state control, because they'd never seen that before. People used to kill each other by the millions because the government decided what religion everyone was going to be. And then they'd kill each other if we made that rule. And you know what we have in the United States? No rules! Anarchy, complete anarchy. People wandering around doing all those people going to Hades because they completely misunderstand Scripture. And somebody should do something about it. No, actually, nobody should do anything about it. And if we can leave people alone to send themselves to everlasting Hades, I think we should leave them alone to make other decisions that are less permanent and damaging. Well, maybe they'd braid someone's hair incorrectly. We must stop that. Well, that guy's going to hell. Well, they used to feel they had to go chop his head off or burn him at the stake or something to make it better. We took the government out of a whole zone of life with religious liberty. Just out, which used to be, wars between the Protestants and Catholics in Germany and so on. 7 million people dead. This is a big deal. And then we just said, you know what? Not we don't care. I suppose one cares if your neighbor completely misses the boat on Leviticus. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to do anything about it. How about that? Okay? Nothing, drop a leaflet off under his door. Straighten him out. But I just think we have to think big about how, we're in the process of moving away from the criminalization of cannabis. And for the last 40 years, we ruined people's lives, arrested millions of people because we could, because we were the government, because we were the state, because we were going to tell. We know what you should do. We had prohibition, and that gave us organized crime. And it was a big mistake, well, but some people drink too much. Yes, that's right. But you know what was worse? Prohibition. And so there's a whole series of zones where we're now deciding, the government's not going to tell people how to do that.
What about,
drive taxis is one of them.
Drive taxis, cannabis, those are areas probably, again, we'd find agreement. But what about things like, in economics speak, where the negative externalities, where unlike religion, where presumably we can live and let live, that's really not a problem. But the ultimate rationale for the EPA or food inspection systems or the like is that, left to their own devices, markets won't take into account the costs that they're imposing on other people. How do you think about, should we have an EPA? Should we have SEC, food inspection systems, et cetera, et cetera? There's a whole range of those kinds of functions.
Yeah, the idea that that restaurants regularly poison their customers if the government wasn't telling them not to strikes me as counterfactual and unlikely. And we used to handle these things through torts. If you go into a restaurant and they poisoned you, you could sue them and take away all their money, which is more than the government does by taking away their license to run a place if they do something wrong. Ditto if somebody has something they sold you, a car that blows up or something. These are all handled by torts, and were over the years. So one of the questions is, how do you solve a problem with the least amount of state control over people's lives and the least interference in what people do, and at the least cost? The whole, just quickly, I passed out these things. This is my favorite. This is your government at work. The police steal more stuff than burglars do in the United States, okay? Civil asset forfeiture. Civil asset forfeiture. This is not, we caught you robbing the bank, we take the money from the bank away from you, okay? When we convict you of bank robbery. This is, we don't have to convict you of anything. We don't even have to charge you with something, okay? And we take your car because we think it was something to do with drugs, and we take the money in your pocket, and we go take your debit card and clean out your bank account, because that money might also be attached to some crime that we haven't quite listed down yet. This is serious stuff. This is billions of dollars, thousands of people's lives.
John Oliver has a great piece on that. If you want a funny take on it, very serious. Actually.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it's criminal justice reform is another area where people have begun to look at something the government does, criminal justice, arresting bad guys, hopefully, convicting guilty bad guys, and putting them in prison or punishing them somehow, and how all that works. And takes out, when you look at it, there are a lot more people in prison than there need to be for a lot more crimes. When we started on this maybe 30 years ago, the group that I worked with in DC, we thought there were 2,000 federal crimes. We now think there's 6,000 federal crimes, and somewhere between 200,000 and 600,000 regulations that can put you in prison. So they might as well be laws because they're regulations, okay, that can put you in prison if you break them. There's no mens rea on most of those. Mens rea means guilty knowledge. You have to know you're doing something wrong. The knowledge of or ignorance of the law is no excuse. I know my parents used to tell you this, right? Ignorance of the law is no excuse. Well, okay, don't rob banks, don't kill people. Got it. But 600,000 regulations, really? I know that. I'm supposed to know that. Of the 5,000 laws or something, I couldn't recite any of them to you from the federal level. So there's just a massive over-criminalization. And again, you don't even have to have intent, which I think is a real problem. So there are a whole series of things we don't need to do. We used to run a draft in the United States. We had a draft briefly during the Civil War, South and North, got rid of it, and then it came back in for World War II, and World War II was over, and they kept the draft going till '71, when Milton Friedman and Richard Nixon and the Ripon Society got together and said, let's get rid of the draft and go to a volunteer army. And now you don't have hundreds of thousands of people's lives massively disrupted, millions massively disrupted to go in the army. If you want to go in the army, you go in the army, and they actually pay you for it, as opposed to kidnap you and not pay you for it. Getting people out of involuntary servitude is a big step forward towards liberty, and was a big win. And turns out it wasn't necessary to defend the country to do that. We were spending 10% of GDP on defense in the 50s vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. We destroyed the Soviet Union at 6% of GDP, and we got it down to 3 or 4, and it's still too high. But 10 to 3, we spend a third as much as a percentage of the economy today at the height as we did during the height of the Cold War. You can spend money more intelligently. You can do things more intelligently and not throw away 7% of GDP.
I want to open the floor to questions. So if you have a question, we'll use the mic that's back here because we're recording this. So think of your question. I'll ask one more, and then we'll open the floor. So please, if you have questions, use them. Come to the mic. There's also one upstairs as well, I believe.
I've been looking down here. We have people upstairs
yeah, there are
too.
people.
Sorry,
Yeah,
hi guys.
It's a very Shakespearean theater.
No, that's cool.
Kind of thing. Deficits. Mm-hmm. Basic question: do deficits matter? Should we be worried that the deficit is roughly a trillion this year and adding to the debt, and now total cumulative debt's about equal to GDP, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Yeah, deficits and homelessness appear when there's a Republican president, and when there's not, they disappear from the newspapers. But the deficits are not the problem. Deficits are a symptom of a problem. The cost of government is total government spending. That's the deadweight cost of government, plus the cost of regulations. So, and because we've been so successful in stopping tax increases, sometimes the state has moved things over into regulations. You have to do this, rather than we steal your money and we pay to do this. You have to do this, regulations. So the deadweight cost of government is the money the government spends, takes out of the real economy and spends, and regulatory burden. Some of it takes by force, taxes. Give me your money, okay. And some it borrows. And they want to look at the part they borrow and say, that's the problem. No, that's a piece of the problem, but the problem is total government spending. You would solve no problem in the world if you said, the government's $100, we take 90 by force in taxes, and we borrow 10. We are going to solve the problem of the deficit. We will steal all 100. Now there is money available for investment in America. Really? What money? The money that you borrowed, you're now taking. It's gone. So the deficit is, the Democrats like to talk about, the Republicans used to talk about the deficit in the 50s, when what they meant was spending is too high and it's bad. And they thought they'd get the Methodists to vote for them if they talked about deficits.
And somewhat after the 50s as well. So,
okay. And deficit's bad, right? Because it was spending.
Right.
And when I was at Harvard, our professor said that was a rotten right-wing lie. Spending is good, and the Republicans are only against deficits because they were against spending, and spending is good, and deficits don't matter. This is back in the 70s, Harvard, economics. And then the Republicans came in and wanted to cut taxes under Reagan. Oh, that would be deficits. Deficits caused by cutting taxes, bad, because it leads to less spending. So then the Democrats said they were against deficits. And then Ross Perot got, I'm confused. The Republicans say they're against deficits, meaning don't spend too much. And the Democrats say they're against deficits, meaning don't cut taxes. And Ross Perot only heard the word deficit and said, you're all agreeing. Why can't we get together? And the point is, they weren't agreeing at all. They were completely talking about two different things. The Republicans wanted lower spending, and the Democrats wanted higher taxes, and they both said they were against deficits. And Ross Perot, despite his big ears, couldn't understand what they were talking about, and ran for office and confused us all. So the deficit is not the problem, spending is.
But I mean, leaving aside that the goal is that it's not about the deficit, but would you cut if you could, if you were czar, would you cut spending by $1 trillion? I mean, what is the magnitude?
Sure.
Is that sort of where you go? And if that's the case, then the question is, what would you cut? Because there's only $400 billion in the discretionary, non-military discretionary. Right. You've already said you'd be happy cutting the military, but you got to go to entitlements to get that kind of money.
Sure.
Right?
You don't cut the federal budget. You reform the federal government to cost less. When Clinton signed the welfare reform, what he did was the bill said every state was getting a certain amount of aid to families with dependent children, welfare. They block granted it out to the states, and they said this will grow with inflation and population, but not more than that. And by the way, state, if you can save money, it's yours, okay? So if we were giving you $1 billion before and you can do what you want to do, for less you can save money. Across the country, we reduced welfare spending by about 30%. Only one state saw spending go up, Hawaii. I still don't quite understand how that happened. But 50 states were able the Fed said, here's the money, and it goes with inflation, so you handle it. A significant spending restraint. If you do the same thing with Medicaid, food stamps, and the other welfare programs, not Social Security, Medicare, which people pay some of their costs, but the ones people pay none of the costs. They just, I'm poor, give me something. So welfare, means-tested welfare. I'm this poor. if you block grant those, you can save a great deal of money, just like welfare, while at the same time maintaining a better level of support for the people who really need it. Partly by requiring single men to go get jobs. Maine did that and dropped their welfare rolls by about a third. So each state can do it, and if they do it harshly and wrong, they'll get unelected. With welfare reform, meaning the means-tested parts of welfare, you block grant in the states and let them grow with inflation. It saves a great deal of money over time. Medicaid is now a third of state budgets. It's busy crowding out schools and everything else. And it was designed to do that, and it's done it. On Social Security, other countries in the world have said, well, why don't you have a 401k instead of a pay-as-you-go Ponzi scheme where you put the money in and then they give it to somebody else, and then when you're 65, you get some money back from somebody who's working then. Were you to take your FICA taxes and put it into a bank account from when you started working till 65, you would have 3 times the income that you get from Social Security. Social Security makes you poorer. Social Security makes you poorer. Social Security makes you poorer. It makes your life less good. And there is a cost to the transition from, you go to all the 65-year-olds and go, oh, we forgot to tell you there's no money, okay? We lied to you. You don't do that. What Chile did, what other countries have done, is you borrow the money to cover the transition costs, and then you pay it off over time. Chile, last time I checked, had higher savings rates than the United States because everybody in Chile's Social Security is a 401k. You're seeing this now state by state for government employees, which used to have the Ponzi scheme, labor union, you pay in and then we pay you a third of your salary, 40, 50% of your salary to retire. Among other things, not everybody has the same preferences. All of government treats people as if they were all, that character in the Charlie Chaplin movie on the assembly line. Everybody's exactly the same. Not everybody's exactly the same. Not everybody has the same interests on when they want to work and when they want to retire. And just physiologically, some people are going to live longer than other people and would want to invest differently. And that allows people to retire both with a nest egg. I mean, why do you have lousy, less good than you'd like upward mobility? Part of it is the wealth differential. The poorer people, the government takes the money from them that they normally save for their retirement, so they don't accumulate wealth, they don't have a nest egg, they don't have a stock portfolio, they don't have a 401k. They have a promise from the government to give you something, a third of what you'd have if you simply save the money in the regular economy. You don't have to invest in anything interesting or radical or risky, just in the normal stock market economy, and you'd retire with significant assets and more payout than you get with Social Security. So when you take a government program that makes everyone poorer and destroys wealth that you could be passing on to children, you probably want to reform that so it doesn't hurt people anymore. There's some point you want to say to these politicians, stop destroying people's lives, stop destroying people's opportunity to get ahead. You are not helping, you're hurting. And when you take something that's a good chunk of the federal government that wanders around thinking it's being helpful, but it's actually destroying people's futures, how about if we fix that? Utah took all government workers about 5 years ago, all new hires have a 401k. So the state, you're a policeman, a fireman, a teacher, whatever, state puts in here's your salary, that's yours. 10% of your salary goes in a 401k. You can match it with 10% if you want. And then whenever you leave, that's yours. And you want to leave tomorrow? That's yours. You want to stick around until you're 65 or 70? Then it's still yours, okay? You are in control of your retirement fund. Instead of saying, well, if you stick around for a few years and you leave, you got nothing because you didn't invest. And what if you want to move from one job to another? I moved from here to some other place. You get screwed. You want people to be more mobile. The workforce is made less mobile. by pensions that don't move with people. States are moving towards that. The private sectors, largely outside of the the unionized industries, still operate like dinosaurs. But the non-union industries, all the new high-tech guys and regular businesses, have defined contribution pensions that you own, you control, move with you.
That's true. I'm tempted to follow up, but I will not. And open the floor for questions. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. I'm Paul Forrester. I'm a senior studying political science and philosophy. And I just wanted to follow up on this last question of entitlements. A lot of people have floated the idea recently of replacing all of the federal welfare programs with a universal basic income. And I just wanted to get your comment on what you think about that idea.
I think it's a bad idea. There was actually, Finland did a little study on this. They set up some town and it didn't work out well for them. So they have actually looked at this and tried this out in different places. It kills the incentive to work, as you might imagine. And so it doesn't do what you'd want it to. The challenge is, what gets you ahead is working. It's not the income. If you pay somebody an income for not working, it doesn't have any of the benefits that somebody who shows up for work day after day has in terms of developing the habits to be successful. The most important thing when people hire is they need to know you're going to be there every day, which for people who haven't been working for a while is a new concept. I came to work yesterday, today again. Like my mom, I made dinner last night. What are you talking about, dinner? But getting ready for working itself and the earned success. I mean, all the studies on what happiness are, what makes people happy is not income, it's earned success. The sense that you have, the correct sense that I earned this. That's why people who win the lottery don't get happier than they used to be. But people who get a raise are happier.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Connor. I'm a senior public policy major. And my question's about immigration. So you've been a proponent of comprehensive immigration reform for a while. You've said that unauthorized immigrants are, quote, completely innocent parties in all of this. And I'm wondering how we can build a coalition for comprehensive immigration reform when the Democratic Party and organized labor are so heavily against guest worker provisions, and now the Republican Party just last year, 95% of House Republicans voted to cut legal immigration by 40%. So how does that work?
Yeah, immigration is an interesting issue. It's what makes the United States different from the rest of the world was, one, our lower taxes, dramatically lower taxes than the rest of the world. Many of the colonies were set up as tax breaks. When the Swedes, there were some Swedish colonies over here, I didn't know this, but they were all set up with tax exemption. So lower taxes and open immigration. And that's what made us different from other countries. And I think a better appreciation of property rights than other countries do. When you own land in the United States, you own everything under it, like oil and natural gas or gold or sand or gravel or whatever's down there. The rest of the world, that's not true. The king owns what's under the ground. You have the top right. And if they find something, they kind of push it aside and drill holes in the ground. But immigration has been a key part to American success and our ability to grow and compete with the rest of the world. So I'm generally an enthusiast for immigration. I'm in favor of legal immigration. I think we should expand the number of people who can come here legally. I think we're about to do that because we've run out of workers. You've seen the number, 7 million jobs and fewer than that people in the workforce. We can stretch that somewhat. We need to work on getting people who are former offenders back into the workforce. We need to work at people who've been out of work so long that they're not working or not in the workforce, to bring them in as well. But those are not huge numbers. But they're not zero either. So I think the deal that will probably, prediction, the president wants border security. I think it's perfectly reasonable to have border security. I don't want Canadians wandering everywhere. But the DACA students will get a deal that protects them. H-1B visas, which are important to the high-tech world, to universities. We need to dramatically expand because people are moving to Canada because they can't get here. No one should be forced to live in Canada. This is ridiculous. There's got to be some Geneva Convention against this. And H-2 visas
You're for convention, is that right?
What is it?
You're for convention, is that right?
No, only when
Just
picking,
checking.
Only when
That's
picking
right.
on the Canadians. The H-2 visas, the ones for regional, for temporary work, where people work on ski slopes for 2 months or whatever. There's a need for a lot more of those. But you're correct that and I've been working on this for 25 years, and the only union that would ever help us was the International Lady Garment Workers Union. And we were always fighting the other unions who were against everything, and the unions brag that they were behind every restrictionist immigration law, from the Chinese Exclusion Act to the effort of the Japanese Exclusion Act, and that's true, they were. They were what killed the Gang of Eight effort by being so restrictive on legal immigration for people who work. They don't mind people coming in, they mind them working. And that's a challenge because the Ds say that they're for, actually they don't, you'd think they are for immigration, but the unions don't allow it. And so it's going to be tough to come to an agreement or a deal that the unions won't veto. They killed the deal that Bush had with the Senate, and the guy who carried the letter into the room and said the AFL says no, this is not happening, and killed immigration reform was Senator Barack Obama, getting his chops with the unions. So it gets pretty confusing when you think you know who's on which team, but that's why you saw nothing in the first 2 years of the Obama administration on immigration when they had complete supermajorities, because they're not actually for actually doing anything on it. But if they're out of power, they can yell at the Republicans, oh, the Republicans are mean. But when they were in power, they didn't do it. So it's an interesting one. I think when you have a strong economy, the grumpiness factor of people thinking that I don't have a job, my cousin doesn't have a job, my neighbor doesn't have a job, it must be immigrants, okay? That makes more sense to people when they're grumpy and unemployed. When now 75% of the people who are unemployed today think they'll have a job in the next year. That's not grumpy, okay? That's pretty optimistic. The unemployed people are optimistic. That's a good sign. That's very healthy. I think we can have a much broader, more productive conversation about immigration. How do we have more legal immigration and less illegal immigration or something? I think we can do that a lot easier with a growing economy than you can with a cramped economy. And we are now back to growing.
Let's take a question from upstairs. Is it on? Oh, it's not on. It is on. Try it again. There you go. They got it now.
Perfect, thank you. Hi, I'm Kelly. I'm a master's student, and I wanted to know what you thought about how you reconcile the theoretical world of a smaller government and a more free economic system with the realities of racism and discriminatory practices at large.
Well, I think that it's important for us to end state-based racism and discrimination. The Davis-Bacon Act, which was passed in 1930, was designed, and they said so on the floor of the Senate and the House when they passed it, to keep blacks who are moving up from the South up to New York from competing with white unionized labor. That's why the Davis-Bacon Act says that you have a floor on how much you pay people if you work to build roads or anything the government builds. This is also done in South Africa for the same reasons. But the South Africans don't have that law anymore. We do, okay? The Davis-Bacon law is there because the unions like it. It's now used against Hispanics. And I think we should get rid of that law. It was racist in intent, it was racist in effect, and it needs to be defeated. And anytime the unions want to get rid of it, it's gone. But they like it, and the Democratic Party has in its platform to keep it going. So that's got to go. All the racial quotas and preferences and people getting a job because they claim they're an Indian and getting $300,000 jobs, that's racism and has to stop. So we need to treat people, you walk in the door, you're an American citizen, full stop, that's all I need to know about you. Good, we're cool. And no government should make any decision about anybody based on the color of their skin or what religion they are or where their grandparents came from or any of that stuff. And the problem is the government keeps these numbers and statistics and stuff, and when you sign up for the census, they want to know what color you are. They don't ask what religion you are. Why in the world are they asking the other stuff? So we need to say no to all state-based racism, and that leads to getting rid of government laws which are racist is step one on getting rid of racism.
I'm getting the time signal here, so I'm aware there's a line of people here. I'm going to ask whether we take 3 questions at once, and I'm sure Grover would be happy to talk with you a little bit afterwards if you have questions on the side. But why don't we take 3 questions, and then I'll let you respond to all 3 if that's
sure.
all right. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Mr. Norquist. So nice to...
Is that a question or?
No. But my name's Jonathan, and my question is about tax havens. So with like the Panama Papers, things like that.
About what?
Tax havens. International tax havens.
International taxes.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Tax havens. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
International tax havens. Yes, yes.
Right. So my understanding is that even though the number of people actually using the international system, so like storing money in Switzerland, for example, Hong Kong, the actual number of people using the system has decreased. The actual amount of wealth inside the system has increased. And we see that with things like the Panama Papers. So my question to you is, does the United States government have a role in kind of regulating this? Is it the fault of high tax rates, or is it even a problem at all?
Good question. Yeah.
Okay, we'll take it.
I'll do 3 and I'll answer them together.
Yeah, good.
Hi, my name's Craig Shireen. I'm a political science major. I'm a junior. I'm from the state of Florida, so one of the biggest things in the Trump tax cuts was the elimination of the SALT deduction. Is the fact that Trump eliminated the SALT deduction an increase of taxes that would violate your pledge? Or is it more of based on principle? I opposed it because people in Texas and taxpayers in Texas and Florida and all the other no income tax states were subsidizing the California government to have a 14% top marginal rate.
Good question. I can do
Thank you.
5 quickly.
Can you do 5?
Yeah, I can do 5.
All right, we'll
I can only juggle 3 balls
all
at
right,
a time, but I can do 5 questions.
Short questions.
Yep.
And then we'll see him answer 5.
Matthew, 3rd question really quickly. A lot of the views you expressed this evening seem to have a very strong libertarian bent to them. So going from that, my question is, how do you, on a more philosophical note, reconcile justice with taxes? Is a progressive taxation system just? If it was up to you, would you have a flat tax system? How do you think about that?
Okay.
All right, go ahead. Quick, short question.
Hi, I'm Steven, and I want to ask about Medicare for All, and that Cortez talks about Medicare for All, and she speaks about basically death panels. And if you look statistically, I think around 20,000 people die per year, and that's more of a conservative estimate every year as a result of a lack of health care. And a lot of people will argue that these private insurance companies are price gouging companies. So my question to you would be, how do you deal with that problem? Because it's a major concern for a lot of Americans. And would you suggest like a short-term subsidy, or would you suggest something different?
Okay.
All right. One more.
Hi there, my name is John. How far do you believe the Second Amendment extends, particularly in terms of, I mean, you can hear people, let's say it should be the equivalent of grenades, or even as far as nuclear weapons. So how do you feel about that?
So how far should the Second Amendment
okay.
extend? Well, that is a lot of territory, so we'll give you a few minutes to answer all those good questions.
Second Amendment, we're fine with rifles and pistols. I passed out this list of how many people have concealed carry permits in the United States, concealed weapons permits. We're now at about 17.5 million Americans have the right to carry a concealed weapon. And when you look at where they passed them, crime dropped dramatically in those states as they passed concealed carry. The more people in a state that have concealed carry, the fewer rapes, the fewer murders, the fewer assaults. They will rob your car when you're not in it, but person-on-person rapes, murders, robberies, way down, because the person you hit might have a gun. So that's been an extremely important part of the drop of crime, which started, frankly, as concealed carry permits started to move through the country and expand. You notice Texas is behind Florida, because Florida got concealed carry permits 10 years earlier, and also saw its crime drop after Florida did. So I think the Second Amendment is much more secure with the present court, but mostly 17.5 million people who have a personal relationship with their firearm, as opposed to hunters who lock it up in the basement and go annoy Bambi's relatives a couple weekends a year. That's not quite the same relationship with a firearm in terms of protection. Tax havens. The Europeans consider us a tax haven. And what the Europeans want in, what the Germans, I'm sorry, Europeans, that's not fair. What the Germans and the French want is a floor under everybody else's ability to tax. You know, they've been beating up on Ireland because they have a 12.5% corporate tax rate. And they don't like Hungary because they have a 9% corporate tax rate. And people are investing in other countries than Germany and France, which have higher taxes. And they consider us to be, they announced as soon as we said we were going to 21 that we were a tax haven. So I think we need to be, tax havens are created by other places that tax too heavily, because then people who tax less are tax havens. And we should go to 15% instead of the 21 we're at. But even as we've gone to 21, we have brought about $600 billion back to the United States since the tax cut took effect of American earnings overseas. But more than that, I met with the German legislators, and they go, we used to be able to go to people in Brazil with $1 million and say, invest in Germany, not America. The Americans will take 35 cents on the dollar. We only take 25 cents. Now, they're a little more secure and safe, and they're not sitting next to Russia, but you know, they take 10% more than we do. So now what do we tell them? The Americans are at 21 and we're at 25. They said people are just going to quit investing in our country and those giant sucking sound in the United States. So I'm in favor of the United States being a tax haven and being low taxes. Flat tax. I'm generally in favor of a single rate tax. I'm from Massachusetts originally before emigrating to the United States. But in Massachusetts, we have a single rate tax by Constitution. In the Constitution, it says you have an income tax, it must be a single rate. So does Illinois. Our tax is 5%. Our tax is low compared to other blue states, because in Massachusetts, if they want to raise the income tax, they say, I've got a really good idea, and you're all paying for it. And then people go, then we're all listening. Speak clearly. And they go, well, it wasn't that good an idea. And remember when Obama ran for president, he said, I've got many ideas, and 1% will pay for them. 1% will pay for nobody else, 1%. And before him, Clinton, only 2% will pay for them. Now, when they get in, they raise gasoline taxes on everybody, and Obamacare hits a lot of people, but they promise that they'll only hit some. I like the idea of a single rate tax, one, because you treat everybody the same, two, then you don't divide people into different groups. You pay 30%, you pay 20%, you pay 10%, and you play people off each other. This is the Richard Speck theory of tax increases. You divide people into different groups, and you take them out of the room one at a time. If the politicians have to take you young people don't get this. If you take everybody on at once, it's more difficult to raise taxes. That's why I like the flat tax, because it's tougher to raise. Medicare for all, I think they've costed that out. The liberal think tank costed out about $32 trillion. The challenge is it also makes all your life insurance or your health insurance illegal. It will be illegal for you to buy your own health insurance under the legislation put forward by our friend from Vermont, the senator. It's a massive, It's the system that other countries that had something like that are walking away from. Britain, Canada are trying to get less. They keep prices down by rationing, and we'd rather not do that. There's a lot of stuff we can do. The FDA is very slow to license new drugs. Used to cost $100 million to get a new drug. Now costs $1.3 billion to get a new drug. This makes the cost of drugs go up. But also means that a lot of smaller improvements don't happen because you don't invest in a drug that's 30% better than the old way of doing things, because you've got to have a huge hit on your hands to cover the cost of $1.3 billion. That's a lot of money. And most of that cost is after they decided it was safe, they now do all these studies to see if it's effective or effective enough. Just because it's effective, they don't allow you to do it unless it's really much better than something else. Why? Because different drugs are going to be, different people have different effects on drugs. Why would you tell somebody you can't sell something that's safe and effective because we don't think it's a big enough step forward to do that? But that's what, and then, so you spend years on the fourth, the three things you do, and the fourth one is it really cool enough for something? It gets very damaging. Whenever the FDA tells you, we've approved a new drug, took us 10 years, and it's really great because we're going to save 5,000 lives a year. And in the last 10 years, what happened? 5,000 a year. Now, if you could have done that in 5 years, you would have saved 25,000 lives. But you were futzing around, taking a long time, deciding you wanted to prove it was effective, not just safe. The Right to Try movement, coming out of the Goldwater Institute in Arizona, started getting states, 41 states passed laws that said, I know the FDA says that once they've said a drug is safe, you can't use it or buy it until 5 or 6 years later it's effective. And then more than that if it's cool effective. We say in our state, as soon as it's safe, it's legal here. So basically like medical marijuana. We say this is legal, this is legal. 41 states did that, and the Fed said, oh, this is not necessary, this is not necessary. And they took the very long process to get into compassionate use from about 300 hours to half an hour, okay, because they were looking bad. And then there are too many kids, the twins where one was in the trial system and one wasn't, and the one that wasn't in is never going to be the same because the FDA killed the kid. You know, and the FDA got so bad they gave up, and we passed a law in the federal government that said once it's safe, it's legal for people to use. And it's not everything we want, but it is a step in the right direction, and the FDA is killing fewer people now than it would have in the past because of this. So there's a whole series of things that we can do, but most of them are having the government get out of healthcare, not more into healthcare. Doctors' licenses should be good across state lines. There are a whole bunch of doctors retired in Florida who don't work in Florida because the Florida doctors have banned imports coming in and working part-time. Yeah, you know, they don't want the competition. Well, maybe older people in Florida would like the more doctors. So we've got to quit treating this like a cartel or a guild for the benefit of the guild members rather than for the people. So when we get rid of all those government laws that make our healthcare more expensive and more destructive, then you could have some conversation about what else do you want to do. But let's start by stopping the destructive part. And I missed one of them.
Have you covered them? Well,
Oh, salt deduction, thank you.
Very quickly.
The salt deduction is state and local taxes, and as you say, states, low-tax states have been subsidizing high-tax states by giving people a tax deduction for high property taxes, high income taxes, mostly rich people. Most of the money goes to the top 1%. The Democrats are very solicitous of the top 1% in this case. I think it's a good idea to get rid of that deduction. I'd get rid of all of it. They got rid of everything after 10,000 because you don't want to be subsidizing big government and having people who have been serious about keeping their government from being too expensive, subsidizing Connecticut, Illinois, California, New York. Because of that, we're starting to see the high tax states like Cuomo announce, one, this is killing us because people are leaving. What do you mean? This is. Your income tax, your property tax are doing this. You can fix this, Mr. Cuomo. Nobody else needs to do anything. You can cut your income tax, and he will. There's a high millionaire's tax that he put in that lapses like this year. He's going to let it lapse. So it ends the subsidy of high taxes and incompetent governors, because we have too many incompetent governors. We shouldn't be subsidizing them.
Well, I think we will have to leave it there. I think whether you agree or disagree entirely with Grover Norquist, I think we'll probably all agree that he's a formidable advocate for his views and deeply knowledgeable. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you all.
Thank you up there. Thank you.